The rain came sideways that Tuesday evening, the kind of cold, driving October rain that found every gap in a coat and every crack in a windowsill. On Tremont Street in the south end of Boston, the gas lamps along the sidewalk threw amber circles onto the wet cobblestones, and the reflections trembled and broke apart with every passing gust. Whitfield Gravener was 32 years old, and he was walking home with a rolled architectural survey tucked under his arm and mud on his boots. He had spent the day measuring warehouse foundations along the waterfront for a shipping company that had already delayed payment twice. The work was good enough. The pay when it finally came was enough. It was the kind of life that required no great ambition, only steady hands and a reliable eye for dimension, and Whitfield Gravener had both. He turned off Tremont and started up the narrow stoop toward the third-floor landing, and that was when he saw it. A single sheet of paper folded once pinned to the wooden door with an iron nail driven straight into the grain. Not taped, not slipped through the mail slot. Nailed. He stood in the rain and read it without moving from the top step. The language was formal and dense, the way legal documents always are when they intend to say something brutal without appearing to feel anything about it. But the meaning was perfectly clear. Whitfield and Orinthia Gravener, residents of the third-floor apartment at 441 Tremont Street, South End, Boston, were hereby ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours. The notice was issued under the authority of Pinnacle Land Trust, registered in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, represented by its agent, Mr. Remington Whitmore. Whitfield had never heard of Pinnacle Land Trust. He had never signed a lease with anyone by that name. For 7 years, he and Orinthia had paid their rent to a man named Harrison Graves, a retired sea merchant who owned the entire Draystone and Brick Row and who collected rent every first of the month with a handshake and a brief remark about the weather. He pulled the nail out of the door with his thumbnail, folded the paper again, and went inside. Orinthia was at the kitchen table grading arithmetic papers by the light of 2 oil lamps. She taught at Ward 9 Primary School, 6 blocks east, and the stack in front of her was 3 inches thick. She looked up when he came in, read his face before he said a word, and set her pen down. He placed the notice on the table between them and watched her read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down flat with both palms on it, as though she were pressing something into the wood that she did not want to escape. Harrison sold the building, she said. It was not a question. He must have, quietly and without telling any of us, to a company neither of us has ever heard of. Through a shell entity, most likely. That is how they do it now. Orinthia looked at the wall above his head for a moment. She was 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back at the nape of her neck, and steady gray eyes that had never once in all the time Whitfield had known her shown fear before they had first evaluated a situation completely. She was evaluating now. They cannot simply nail a notice to our door and expect us gone in 48 hours, she said. There are procedures. There are procedures when the owner follows them, Whitfield said. Pinnacle Land Trust is claiming the building requires urgent structural renovation. They are invoking the substantial renovation clause in the Massachusetts landlord statute. If the claim is accepted, rent control protections do not apply. Who accepted it? A city inspector, whose name I suspect will not be easy to find. The room was quiet except for the rain on the windows and the hiss of the lamps. Orinthia picked up the notice again and read it one more time. Then she set it back down, reached for her pen, and said, "We are going to fight this." They did. They found Harlan Fairweather through a referral from a neighbor 2 floors below who had survived a similar attempt by a different developer 3 years earlier. Fairweather operated from a second-floor office on Tremont Row, past a frosted glass door with his name painted in block letters and a waiting area that smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and old paper. He was 48 years old, wide through the shoulders, with iron gray hair and a way of listening that felt like being examined under good light. He despised real estate speculators with the particular intensity of a man who had a personal reason, and he did. His wife had lost her family home to a fraudulent mortgage foreclosure in 1875, and he had not forgotten it and did not intend to. He listened to Whitfield's account without interruption, then spent 20 minutes reading the notice and the deed transfer documents Whitfield had retrieved from the county recorder's office that same afternoon. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together. Pinnacle Land Trust acquired the entire block through 3 separate transfers, completed within 30 days, Fairweather said. The speed is deliberate. They do not want the tenants to organize before the process is complete. The substantial renovation clause is their instrument. It is a genuine provision of Massachusetts law, but it was written for genuine structural emergencies, not manufactured ones. The question is whether we can prove the emergency is manufactured. Can we? Whitfield asked. We can try. I have 14 other households on this block willing to join a collective action. That gives us standing, and it gives us a story that the newspapers will not ignore. Judges in Suffolk County do not enjoy reading about themselves in the morning edition. Orinthia was watching Fairweather carefully. How long will it take? 3 months minimum, possibly longer. And the cost? Fairweather named a figure. It was not small. Orinthia and Whitfield exchanged a look, and then Whitfield said they would find it. For 3 months they fought. Fairweather filed the collective action, obtained depositions, challenged the structural inspection report. The newspapers did cover it briefly. But Pinnacle Land Trust retained 2 attorneys from Caldwell and Morse, the largest commercial law firm in Boston, and those attorneys did not come to win arguments. They came to make the process so expensive and so slow and so grinding that the tenants would exhaust themselves and their resources before any judge ever issued a final ruling. They dragged out every procedural step. They filed counter motions on technicalities. They requested discovery on documents that did not exist. And at the 3rd hearing, a Caldwell and Morse attorney named Price stood before the bench and produced documentation suggesting that Whitfield Gravener had outstanding unpaid invoices from 2 previous clients, presenting this as evidence that the plaintiffs lacked the financial stability to claim legitimate tenancy. Whitfield sat in the gallery and felt something cold move through him. They had not compiled that information in response to the lawsuit. They had compiled it before the lawsuit, before the notice on the door. They had researched every tenant in the building before they ever drove that iron nail into the wood. The judge ruled in favor of Pinnacle Land Trust on a Thursday in late January of 1888. The substantial renovation clause was upheld. All residents were ordered to vacate within 30 days. Fairweather shook Whitfield's hand outside the courthouse. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. I am sorry, Fairweather said. The clause was written with ambiguity, and ambiguity always favors money in a courtroom. Whitfield nodded. There was nothing useful to say. That evening, sitting on the edge of their mattress while the packed boxes rose around them, Orinthia said, They maneuvered us using a law so vague nobody can see the edges of it. You cannot fight something you cannot measure. Whitfield looked at her. She was not asking for comfort. She was thinking aloud, working through the architecture of their situation, the way he worked through a floor plan, looking for the structural logic beneath the surface. Then we find something we can measure, he said. Their savings after legal fees and the months Whitfield had lost, chasing clients who hired other people while he was occupied with the court battle, stood at $312. In the Boston of 1888, that was not enough to pay the first and last month's rent, plus deposit on a comparable apartment. The rental market in the South End had transformed in the past 2 years. Buildings that had housed craftsmen and school teachers were being emptied and refilled with the newly wealthy who had arrived on the railroads from New York and Philadelphia, and the landlords had adjusted their expectations accordingly. Orinthia began reading every newspaper she could find, not just the Globe and the Evening Transcript. She sent letters to Fairweather asking for any publications that listed county property sales tax, auction notices, foreclosure listings. She spread them across the kitchen table every evening after dinner and read through the small print with the same methodical patience she brought to grading arithmetic. On a Wednesday night in early February, she found it. It was a small notice, 3 lines long, in the classified section of the Coos County Bulletin, a weekly paper she had requested from a postal contact in Lancaster, New Hampshire. She set the paper flat on the table and called Whitfield over without raising her voice. The notice read, Property for public tax auction, Coos County, New Hampshire. 4 1/2 acres, Great North Woods District. Includes A-frame wood frame structure, constructed 1861. Previous owner Prescott Penhaligon, deceased, no will. 22 years property taxes outstanding. Opening bid $140. Cash payment only. As is condition. Interested parties contact Coos County Clerk's Office, Lancaster. Whitfield read it 3 times. He had surveyed parts of the White Mountains region in 1882, working a railroad contract. He knew what Coos County meant. He knew what the Great North Woods meant in November, which was when winter arrived there and did not leave until May. He knew what a 4 1/2 acre parcel described as including a wood frame structure in as-is condition almost certainly looked like. But Orinthia was watching him with an expression he recognized. It was not desperation. Orinthia Gravener did not do desperation. It was the expression she wore when she had made a calculation and was waiting to see whether he arrived at the same answer. "We could buy it outright," she said. "Own it completely. No landlord, no lease, no Remington Whitmore. No company with a name nobody has ever heard of can nail a notice to the door of something that belongs to us and only us. It is 4 hours north of everything we know. Everything we know just evicted us." He looked at the notice again. $140. They had 312. "Who was Prescott Penhaligon?" he asked. Orinthia shook her head. She did not know. The notice said nothing beyond the name and the unpaid taxes. They wrote to the Coos County clerk that same night. 2 weeks later, they took the train north to Lancaster and attended the tax auction in a cold county administrative building that smelled of pine resin and old wool. There were 7 other bidders present, most of them local timber speculators looking for acreage. The Penhaligon parcel drew little interest at first. $140 was called, and Whitfield raised his hand. Then a man in the back of the room, heavy-set and wearing a canvas work coat, raised his and said $155. Whitfield said $160. The man paused, looked at Whitfield carefully with an attention that seemed disproportionate to a tax auction for a piece of forested land with a ruined cabin on it. Then he lowered his hand and said nothing more. The county clerk brought the gavel down. Whitfield Gravener, $160. He and Orinthia paid at the clerk's window and collected the deed. As they walked out into the February cold, Whitfield looked back once. The man in the canvas coat was watching them from across the room. He made no move to follow. He only watched. In the wagon heading toward the road south, Orinthia said quietly, "Why did he stop at 160? Whitfield had been thinking about the same thing. A timber speculator pushing a bid by $15 and then abandoning it for no apparent reason was not normal behavior. Timbermen pushed until the price stopped making sense against the board feet they could extract, and a 4.5-acre parcel of mature Northwoods growth was worth considerably more than $160 in raw lumber alone. He had no answer. He filed the question away and told himself it was probably nothing. It was not nothing, but he would not know that for another 3 months. They planned the move for late March, when the worst of the winter would have loosened its grip on the northern roads. Whitfield finished his outstanding survey contracts. Orinthia completed the school term. They sold or gave away everything that would not fit in a hired freight wagon. The dining table, Orinthia's upright piano that she had owned since she was 12, 2 bookshelves, and the books that did not fit into the 4 crates they allowed themselves. On the afternoon before they left Boston, Whitfield walked the block on Tremont Street one last time. The building had already been emptied. Most of the windows on the ground and second floors had been removed from their frames, and the brick exterior had been chalked with demolition marks. In 7 years, he had never once in that building felt anything as significant as what he felt standing in front of it now. Not nostalgia, not grief exactly, but the precise and concentrated anger of a man who understands clearly that something was taken from him and that the taking was deliberate. He turned his back on it and walked away. The road north took them through Manchester, then Concord, then Plymouth, and then the landscape changed completely. The farms and church steeples of southern New Hampshire gave way to dense stands of spruce and fir that closed in from both sides until the road felt less like a road and more like a passage through something vast and indifferent. The March sky was the color of old pewter, and the remnants of snowpack still lay in the shadows under the trees. They stopped for the night in a small town called Grayfield, in a county with fewer than 3,000 residents spread across hundreds of square miles of forest. The town itself was 4 blocks of wooden storefronts arranged around a crossroads, a general goods store, a post office, a smithy, a church, and a boarding house run by a woman named Millicent Gravener. The shared surname was coincidence, as Whitfield confirmed when he signed the register, and Millicent acknowledged it with a brief nod and no further comment, which told him something about her character before she had said another word. Millicent Gravener was 60 years old, broad through the shoulders, with white hair pinned flat against her head, and eyes that were pale blue and extremely observant. She had run the boarding house for 30 years since her husband died of a fever the winter after their youngest was born, and in 30 years she had developed an intimate familiarity with the particular look of people who had come a long way and were not entirely certain what they would find at the end of it. She gave them a room at the top of the stairs, brought them coffee and a plate of cold roast pork, and sat down at the table with them without being asked, which suggested she had something specific she intended to say. "I hear you bought the Penhaligon property," she said. Whitfield looked up. He had mentioned it to no one in Grayfield. The deed transfer was a county record, but he had not expected anyone to know his name or his business before he had been in town for 20 minutes. "We did," he said. Millicent wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the window. The glass was dark against the night. "Prescott Penhaligon came to this county in 1865, she said. "No one knew where he came from. He paid cash for everything, which in a small town is the kind of thing people remember. He built that cabin himself, or mostly himself, with help from two men he brought up from the South and who left again when the work was done. After that, he did not permit anyone within half a mile of the property. He fired a rifle over the heads of 3 timbermen who tried to cut across his land in 1872. He bought his supplies here in town twice a year, paid without conversation, and left." She paused and drank her coffee. "People said he was a survivalist, a man who had decided the world outside his trees was not something he wished to participate in any further. There were other stories too, but those I cannot verify." "What other stories?" Orinthia asked. "That he had done something back east that he was living far from. That the isolation was not preference but necessity." Millicent set her cup down. "I am not in the business of repeating rumors. I am telling you what I know to be fact. The man lived out there for 20 years and allowed no one near him, and when he died 2 winters ago, the county men who went to collect the body found the cabin locked from the outside. He had died in the woodshed, alone." The room was quiet. The fire in the small stove in the corner ticked softly. Millicent stood, gathered the plates, and paused at the door. She turned back once, her expression neutral but deliberate. "Be careful with the floors," she said. Then she went through the door and left them sitting with that. Orinthia looked at Whitfield. He looked at Orinthia. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing sensible to say about a warning that specific attached to no explanation whatsoever. The next morning they found the cabin. The access road had been unmaintained for 2 years and was returning to forest with considerable ambition. Branches had grown across it at head height, and the wheel ruts had filled with ice and leaf mold. They left the wagon at the nearest clear turnout and carried what they needed by hand the last quarter mile. The cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by spruce trees that had grown close over the decades until they pressed against the north and east walls. The structure was A-frame, steeply pitched, maybe 38 feet long at the base. The roof had lost several courses of cedar shake on the south-facing slope and had been partially replaced long ago with a patch of tin that had since rusted through in 2 places. The porch had partly collapsed. All 4 windows were boarded from the outside, with planks nailed horizontally, which gave the building the look of something that had decided to close its eyes. Inside, the smell was the first thing, damp earth and mildew, and something older underneath, dry and metallic like old iron left sealed in a confined space for a very long time. The interior was a single floor with a loft above. The main room was the largest space, running most of the front length of the cabin. Behind it, separated by a short hallway and a massive central structure of stacked river stone, were a small kitchen and a back room that had served as sleeping quarters. The stone structure was the dominant feature of the interior, floor to ceiling, a chimney and firebox assembly built from river cobble and flat granite mortared in place with what must have been considerable labor. It was wider than any firebox Whitfield had ever seen in a residential structure. Wider by a substantial margin. They spent their first night on the floor in bedrolls, listening to the building settle around them in the cold. Whitfield lay on his back staring at the rafters overhead. The silence of the forest was so complete it had texture. No street noise, no horse traffic, no neighbors. Only the creak of cooling wood, and twice in the night the distant sound of something large moving through the trees. He thought about Remington Whitmore in his London-made vest in that warm paneled office on State Street. He thought about the Caldwell and Morris attorney manufacturing a picture of him as financially unreliable in front of a judge. He thought about the iron nail in the door. He did not sleep much. Morning came gray and cold, and with it the full inventory of everything the cabin required. The roof, the floor in the back room where water had gotten beneath the boards and rotted the substructure. The collapsed porch, the chimney mortar which had dried and crumbled in sections. It was a list that would take months and cost more than they had spent on the property itself. But they had no rent to pay and no landlord to answer to, and Whitfield had discovered long ago that exhaustion and physical purpose were in certain circumstances almost interchangeable with peace of mind. They worked. In the 3rd week, Orinthia was sorting through the contents of a wooden box they had found wedged behind the kitchen wall when she pulled out a folded newspaper. It was yellow and soft at the creases, and when she opened it carefully, it did not tear. It was a copy of the Boston Daily Advertiser dated the 14th of March, 1861. The front page carried several columns about the opening of hostilities between the states, which was the news that had consumed every paper that month. But in the lower right corner of the page, there was a shorter article under the heading $78,000 Lost in Transit. The article described the disappearance of a federal currency shipment from the Massachusetts Commercial Bank in Boston bound for Portsmouth by secure coach. The currency, freshly printed and unissued, had vanished somewhere on the road north. The coach driver and his two guards were found unconscious on the road with no memory of the attack. No suspects had been identified. The bank and federal authorities were investigating. Orinthia read it twice, and then she looked at something she had initially overlooked. In the margin beside the article, someone had drawn a circle around the headline in red ink. And next to the circle, in precise backward slanting cursive, were two words. Safe, PP, Prescott Penhaligon. She stood at the kitchen window, holding the newspaper with both hands, and looked out at the line of spruce trees, dark against the gray March sky. Prescott Penhaligon had been perhaps 22 years old in 1861. He had arrived in Coos County in 1865, 4 years after the robbery, with enough money to buy land and build a cabin and pay for everything in cash for the next 20 years. He had not permitted anyone within half a mile of his property. He had lived with the particular alertness of a man who expected at any moment to be found. And now the cabin belonged to Whitfield and Orinthia Gravenor, who had never heard of Prescott Penhaligon 3 months ago, and who had arrived here because a real estate trust in Boston had driven them out of their home. Orinthia set the newspaper flat on the kitchen table and walked to the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. She looked at the great stone chimney assembly at the center of the house. Whitfield was in the main room measuring the wall length for new baseboard material. He had his surveyor's notebook out, the small ruled one he always carried, and he was writing numbers in it with the mechanical precision of a man whose training had become reflex. Whitfield, she said. He looked up. Come and look at this, she said, and held out the newspaper. He crossed the room and read it. She watched his face move through the same sequence hers had: recognition, connection, and then the shift to something quieter and more concentrated. He looked up from the paper and at the chimney. Then he looked down at the numbers in his notebook. He had been measuring the interior for 3 hours. The exterior length of the cabin, measured from the foundation corners, was 38 feet. The combined interior measurements, room by room, accounting for wall thickness, at 1 foot total, should have yielded 36 feet of usable interior space. His measurements showed 29. 7 feet were unaccounted for. He walked to the chimney and placed his palm flat against the stone on the left side. He knocked with his knuckles. The sound returned solid and dense, the report of rock behind rock. He moved to the right side and knocked. The same. Then he pressed his hand to the center of the chimney mast between the two largest flat stones and knocked there. The sound was different. Not hollow, but not the same dense solidity either. There was a faint underlying resonance, as though the stone face were the front wall of something rather than the body of something. Whitfield lowered his hand slowly and looked at Orinthia. She was still holding the newspaper. Her expression had settled into the one he associated with her, at her most focused, utterly still, all the ordinary movement of her face suspended, while something important was being assembled behind her eyes. He did not just come here to hide, she said. He came here to store something. Whitfield thought about Millicent Gravenor at the boarding house table, coffee in hand, looking at the dark window. Be careful with the floors. Not the floors, below the floors. He turned toward the corner of the main room where the trapdoor to the cellar was set into the boards. The cellar trapdoor was cut from 2-inch pine planking, set flush with the main floor, with an iron ring pull that had oxidized to the color of dried blood. Whitfield lifted it on the second try. The first time, the suction of years sealed it shut. The second time, he put his full weight into it, and the door came up with a sound like a cork drawn from a very old bottle. The smell that rose out of the opening was not the ordinary smell of a root cellar. It was sulfur and wet clay, and something else beneath both of those. Something dry and mineral, the way the inside of a cannon smells after it has sat unused for a long time. He lowered the oil lamp through the opening first, then himself, finding the top rung of the cellar ladder with his boot. Orinthia followed without being asked. The cellar was perhaps 7 feet across in any direction, with a dirt floor and timber joists for a ceiling so low that Whitfield had to walk with his neck bent. In the lamplight, the earthen walls were dark with moisture, and the corners held the accumulated debris of decades rusted iron hooks, a broken mattock head, 3 glass mason jars with their lids seized shut. But Whitfield was not looking at any of that. He was looking at the center of the cellar directly beneath the main room above, directly beneath the massive stone chimney. A wall of red brick rose from the dirt floor to the timber joists overhead. It was roughly 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, and it had been built with the kind of speed that trades precision for urgency. The mortar was smeared and uneven fingerprints still visible in it in places. The bricks themselves were uniform and commercial, the kind available from any Boston brickyard in the 1860s, entirely different in character from the mortared stone of the house's actual foundation on either side of it. It had been built after the house, by one man working alone who did not want anyone to know it was there. Whitfield put his hand flat on the brick surface. He knocked 3 times in the center. The sound that returned was not the sound of brick against earth. It was the sound of brick against air. Behind this wall, something was open. He turned around and climbed back up the ladder without a word. Orinthia heard him cross the main room floor above her, heard the sound of the tool chest being opened, and then heard his boots on the ladder again. He was carrying the sledgehammer. It was a 10-pound head on a hickory handle bought in Grayfield 2 weeks earlier for clearing the collapsed porch framing. Whitfield set his feet wide on the dirt floor, measured his distance from the wall, drew the hammer back to his right shoulder, and swung. The first strike cracked a single brick down the center. Dust bloomed in the lamplight. He swung again and a section of mortar broke away from the course above. The third blow drove the cracked brick inward and through, and a rush of cold air came out of the gap in a single sustained exhale, like a held breath finally released. It was colder than the cellar air, noticeably measurably colder. And it carried that smell again, dry metal and old time, and something that had been sealed away from the movement of the world for a very long while. Orinthia took the lamp and held it close to the gap. The beam of light entered and found nothing at first, only more darkness. Then it caught something a surface 8 or 9 feet away that threw the light back in a dull, pewter-colored reflection. Whitfield swung the hammer for the next 20 minutes without stopping. He tore the brickwork down in sections, working from the center outward until the opening was large enough to step through. His shoulders were burning and his shirt was soaked through. Orinthia held the lamp steady throughout. She did not speak and she did not step back. When the opening was clear, Whitfield took the lamp from her and stepped through the rubble into the space beyond. It was a room, perfectly square, 7 feet by 7 feet, cut from the earth and sided with timber planking coated in pine tar against moisture. The ceiling was the underside of the stone chimney base, above a solid platform of granite blocks that made the space feel both ancient and deliberate. The air inside was extraordinarily dry. The pine tar on the walls had done its work protecting whatever was in this room from 20 years of New Hampshire winters with a level of forethought that had nothing in common with the rough brickwork of the false wall. The false wall had been built in a panic. This room had been designed. Whitfield raised the lamp and turned slowly. On the left wall, a set of timber shelves held a compact assembly of equipment he recognized after a moment as an early telegraph receiver and transmitter, the kind used by railroad companies in the 1860s. Beside it, stacked in 6 pine crates sealed with wax, were rifle cartridges. The manufacturer's marks on the crates were faded but legible. Winchester Arms, New Haven, Connecticut, 1878. Penhaligon had evidently replenished his ammunition stores in later years, carrying the crates down alone, the same way he had built this room without witnesses, without help, without leaving any trace above ground of what sat below it. He turned to his right. More shelving bare except for 2 rolled canvas bundles tied with leather cord and sealed at each end with wax. He turned to face the back wall. On the back wall, mounted on a heavy timber frame bolted directly into the earth, was the door. It was circular, perhaps 5 feet across. Cast iron and steel assembled from multiple plate sections, riveted together with a vanned wheel handle at its center, and a combination lock mechanism set into the face at chest height. The door was set into the frame on 4 massive strap hinges, and around its perimeter, a series of locking bolts were visible in their housings, the kind that engaged into the frame itself when the combination was set. It was a bank vault door, not a safe, not a strongbox. A vault door of the kind installed in the subterranean chambers of major commercial banks, designed to protect substantial quantities of currency or collateral from theft, fire, and deliberate assault. Whitfield had drawn the architectural plans for 3 bank construction projects since 1882, and he recognized the general type immediately. He stepped forward and looked at the face of the combination mechanism. Set into the steel above the dial in raised letters cast into the metal during manufacture was the maker's name. Herring and Company, Safe Manufacturers, New York, established 1843. Herring and Company built vaults for the largest banks on the eastern seaboard. Their products were specified by bank architects, ordered by bank directors, and installed by the company's own crews. They were not sold to private individuals as a commercial matter. This door did not belong to any bank. It belonged to a man who had bought 4.5 acres of New Hampshire forest in 1865 and built a cabin on top of it. Orinthia was standing at Whitfield's shoulder. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand flat on the cold steel of the door. "He built the cabin around this," she said. "The vault was here first. He built the house on top of it to hide what was below." "Yes," Whitfield said, "which means he brought the door out here before 1865. He would have needed a crew and a wagon and equipment. He planned this while he was still in Boston. He was preparing his exit before he made his exit." Whitfield looked at her. She was right, and the implications of that precision sat between them in the dry, cold air of the hidden room. Prescott Penhaligon had not simply fled. He had engineered his disappearance the way an architect engineers a structure, accounting for load and stress and the long-term integrity of what he was building. He had stolen something, and he had prepared a vault to keep it in, and he had built a house on top of the vault, and he had lived on top of the house for 20 years, slowly dying in the forest, with everything he had taken sealed in the earth beneath his feet. Whitfield took hold of the wheel handle and pulled. The door did not move by a single degree. He tried the combination dial. It turned smoothly, offering no resistance, the internal mechanism still functioning after decades in the dry air of the sealed room. But without the combination sequence, the smooth turning of the dial meant nothing. The bolts remained engaged. The vault remained shut. They stood in the lamplight looking at it. "How do we open it?" Orinthia asked. "We take it apart," Whitfield said. He spent 2 full days in Grayfield purchasing what the task required: steel chisels and 3 weights, a hand drill with a set of hardened bits, a cold chisel for driving through the bolt, housing a pry bar, and more lamp oil. He also needed, though he did not say so in the hardware store, time to think through the engineering of what he was about to attempt. It was at Leander Hollowell's general store during the second day of shopping that the complication arrived. Leander Hollowell was a careful, economical man of 50 who ran his store the way a ship's captain runs a tight vessel. Everything in its place, every transaction noted. No conversation that did not serve a purpose. He had been helpful to Whitfield and Orinthia since their arrival, offering credit on materials and answering questions about local contractors, and he had never once asked what they were doing with what they bought. That morning, as Whitfield was itemizing his order, the front door of the store opened, and a large man came in. Sheriff Obadiah Aldridge was 55 years old, and built like a man who had spent his working life doing things that required physical authority. He wore his badge on his coat lapel and his hat pushed back from his forehead, and the comfortable, unhurried manner of a man accustomed to walking into rooms and having them rearrange themselves around him. He greeted Hollowell by name and then looked at Whitfield with an attention that was far too specific for a casual encounter. "Gravenor," he said, "you are the man who bought the Penhaligon parcel." "That is correct." Aldridge looked at the items assembled on Hollowell's counter: the chisels, the drill, the pry bar. He looked at them long enough to understand what they were collectively for, even if he could not know specifically. Then he looked back at Whitfield. "You planning a lot of excavation work out there?" "Structural repairs," Whitfield said. "The cellar needs reinforcing." Aldridge nodded slowly. He bought a box of matches and a coil of lamp wick from Hollowell, tucked them into his coat pocket, and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back, and his voice, when he spoke again, had dropped half a register. "The North Woods is good land," he said, "but it holds on to things, old foundations, old timber workings. Men who go digging without understanding what they are digging into sometimes find they have created more problem than they started with." He looked at Whitfield without expression. "Best to know the full nature of the ground before you put a tool to it." He left. Whitfield stood at Hollowell's counter for a moment after the door closed. Hollowell was writing in his order book and did not look up. "Does he do that often?" Whitfield asked. "Come in and offer advice to new residents?" Hollowell considered the question with the care he gave all questions. "No," he said, "he does not." Whitfield carried his purchases back to the wagon and drove out of Grayfield with a very clear sense that the margin of time available to him had just become smaller. That evening, he told Orinthia about Aldridge. She listened from across the supper table, hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He is not warning you away from the property in general," she said. "He is warning you away from something specific, something he knows is there." She paused. "How would a county sheriff know what is buried under a reclusive man's cabin?" Whitfield had been asking himself the same question for 3 hours. Penhaligon told him, Whitfield said. Or Penhaligon told someone who told him. A man who lived for 20 years with that secret might have cracked at some point, might have needed someone to know. Or Aldridge found out through other means, Orinthia said, and has been sitting on that knowledge waiting. Either answer was unpleasant. Both of them meant the same thing: they were working against a clock that someone else could see and they could not. They went back to work. The vault door took 3 days to open by force. Whitfield approached it as an engineering problem, working methodically, beginning with the combination lock housing rather than the door itself. The lock was a precision instrument, but it had a structural logic. The tumblers had to align to release the bolt mechanism, and the bolt mechanism connected to a central pin that held the locking bars engaged. If the pin could be displaced without the tumblers, the door would open. He drilled into the housing on an angle calculated from the standard engineering practice of Herring and Company's vault designs, which he had studied in a technical catalog during his railroad survey work in 1882. The hardened steel bits dulled faster than he expected in metal that dense, but he had bought extras. Orinthia worked in shifts beside him, holding the lamp, trading the drill, when his arms gave out trading, back when hers did. The cellar filled with the smell of hot metal and iron dust. Neither of them spoke much during those 3 days. There was nothing to say that the work was not already saying. On the afternoon of the third day, the drill broke through into the housing cavity. Whitfield set the cold chisel against the exposed pin, picked up the hammer, and drove it once hard at the precise angle that would move the pin laterally without compressing it against the bolt. A sound came from deep inside the door, a single resonant clank like a church bell struck underwater. Whitfield set the hammer down. He looked at Orinthia. She was holding the lamp at shoulder height, her face pale and still and completely focused. He stepped forward, took the wheel handle in both hands, and pulled. The door resisted for a moment, the seals along its edge, holding by the compression of decades. Then something released, and the door began to turn on its hinges, swinging outward with a sound that was slow and final, and unlike anything either of them had heard before. Cold air came out of the vault interior in a single sustained movement, as though the space had been holding its breath since 1865 and had only now been permitted to release it. It was dry and faintly metallic, carrying the smell of old leather, old paper, and the specific stillness of air that has not moved in 20 years. Whitfield raised the lamp and stepped forward through the vault door. The interior was cylindrical, perhaps 8 feet deep. Heavy steel shelving ran along the curved walls, bolted to the interior surface at regular intervals. Whitfield's eye moved from left to right, registering what was there. On the central shelf at chest height, running the full width of the vault ledgers, 14 of them, bound in dark leather, each approximately 1.5 inches thick, each with a year written on the spine in faded ink. They ran from 1861 to 1884, with 3 years missing between 1872 and 1875, for no reason Whitfield could immediately identify. And below the ledgers, stacked in 2 columns and wrapped in waxed canvas that had yellowed to the color of old cream currency. Orinthia pushed past his shoulder and stood beside him. She reached out and lifted the corner of the waxed canvas wrapping on the nearest stack. Beneath it were bundled paper notes, each bundle wrapped with a printed paper band that was still legible in the lamplight. She read the band aloud, her voice very quiet. Massachusetts Commercial Bank. Federal Currency Series 1861. Unissued. Sequential Numbering Series 47 through 89. She set the canvas back down carefully. $78,000 in unissued federal currency, sealed in a vault in the North Woods of New Hampshire, untouched since the year Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated. Whitfield reached past the currency and pulled the nearest ledger from the shelf. The spine cracked when he opened it, the binding dry after 2 decades in the sealed air. The first page was not a title page. It went directly to columns, dates, amounts, property addresses, and beside each entry, a notation in a coded shorthand that would take time to parse. He turned to the inside front cover. In the same precise cursive that had circled the newspaper headline upstairs, someone had written a single line. Records of the Colton Ring, PP agent, 1861 to present. Orinthia was looking over his shoulder. He felt her go still. Cornelius Colton. Whitfield knew the name the way most Boston men of his generation knew it, imprecisely, from overheard conversations, from newspaper references that were always slightly oblique from the particular silence that fell in certain rooms when certain subjects came too close to the surface. Colton had run the most sophisticated criminal organization in New England for 2 decades, an operation built not on street violence, but on financial manipulation, on the corruption of city officials and bank clerks, and property inspectors on the patient accumulation of real estate that could absorb and legitimize money that had come from somewhere else. He had been investigated 3 times by federal authorities, and charges had never been brought. In 1883, the Postal Inspector's Office had opened a new investigation, and Colton had relocated to Philadelphia and then dropped from public record entirely. Prescott Penhaligon had been his accountant, his ledger keeper, the man who recorded every transaction, every shell company, every property purchase made with money that needed a new history. Whitfield turned pages slowly, and the architecture of the operation became visible in the columns. Properties acquired across Boston, Providence, and Portland between 1861 and 1884. Each purchased through a succession of company names that changed every few years, each company nominally unrelated to the last, but connected in the ledger by a single line of Penhaligon's handwriting. The entries were meticulous, the handwriting never varied, and the total scale of what had been moved through the operation over 2 decades was, by Whitfield's rapid mental arithmetic, somewhere in excess of $2 million. Then Orinthia pulled the last ledger from the shelf. It was the thinnest of the 14 bound in newer leather than the others, and when she opened it, the ink on the first page was less faded, the paper less yellowed. The entries here were not historical records, but tracking notes, current status updates on the properties from the original ledger written in the same hand, but at intervals across the 1880s. The last entry was dated November of 1885, 2 months before the county records showed Penhaligon's death. She turned through the pages slowly reading. The notations tracked ownership changes, properties that had been sold out of the Colton Network properties, still active properties in transition. The company names had changed. Massachusetts Harbor Associates had become North Continental Property Holdings. North Continental had become something else, and then something else again. She turned to the last page of active entries and ran her finger down the column of addresses. She stopped. Whitfield saw her finger stop and looked at what it was resting on. The entry read Asset 14, Tremont Street Block, South End, Boston. Shell Succession, Massachusetts Harbor. Associates 1861 to 1882. North Continental Property Holdings 1882 to 1886. Current holding entity, Pinnacle Land Trust. Status active liquidation phase. Agent R. Whitmore. Below it in the margin in handwriting that was slightly shakier than the earlier entries, the way handwriting gets when the hand that holds the pen is older and less certain, Penhaligon had added a note. Tenants being cleared Q3 1887. Renovation pretext. Consistent with prior disposal methodology. Orinthia's finger did not move from the page. The sound of the forest outside was very distant. The lamp flame was steady in the still air of the vault. He was watching them, Orinthia said. Her voice was completely flat. From up here in the woods, he was tracking what happened to all of it. Every property, every company name change. He knew what Pinnacle Land Trust was. He knew what R. Whitmore was doing. Whitfield looked at the entry. Tremont Street, their address. The building they had lived in for 7 years. The building Remington Whitmore had purchased through a shell entity and cleared through a manufactured renovation clause. Pinnacle Land Trust was not a new generation of opportunistic speculators. It was the current iteration of the Colton Ring's financial infrastructure, grown sophisticated over 2 decades of operation, now moving to liquidate the original portfolio and convert it fully into legitimate capital. Whitmore was not a property manager. He was the instrument of a criminal enterprise that had been running since before Whitfield Gravenor was born. And the Colton Ring had evicted Whitfield and Orinthia Gravenor from their home in Boston, driven them north into the wilderness, and delivered them directly to the vault that contained the documentary evidence of every crime it had ever committed. Whitfield closed the ledger and held it in his hands for a moment. He thought about the man in the canvas coat at the county auction who had pushed the bidding to $155 and then stopped. He thought about the previous week when a folded note had been found wedged into the frame of the cabin's east-facing window, a strip of brown paper with 8 words written on it in a rough, unpracticed hand. Sell it back to us. Fair price. No signature. No indication of who had left it or when, only the fact of it sitting in the window frame when Orinthia went to open the shutter one morning as though it had grown there overnight. He thought about Sheriff Aldridge in the hardware store looking at the chisels and the drill, and the pry bar telling him that men who dig without understanding the nature of the ground sometimes create more problem than they started with. They had known the vault was here. They had known what was in it, or suspected. Aldridge had been sitting on that knowledge and waiting for years for someone to find the property and discover it. Not to report it, to acquire it quietly before anyone else could. "They do not know that we have found it," Whitfield said. "Aldridge suspects we are looking, but they do not know what we have in our hands right now." Orinthia looked at him across the open vault, across the stacked currency, and the 14 ledgers, and the full documented history of 2 decades of organized crime in New England. "How long do we have before they move?" she asked. Whitfield thought about Aldridge watching him from the door of Hollowell's store, watching him carry a pry bar and drill bits to his wagon. "Hours," he said, "perhaps less." He picked up 3 of the ledgers. Orinthia picked up 3 more. They came back for the canvas-wrapped documents last the rolled schematics Penhaligon had stored alongside everything else, and Whitfield opened one of them quickly on the vault floor, unrolling just enough to see what it was. It was a detailed architectural drawing, floor plan section, and elevation. The paper was heavy drafting stock and the lines were drawn with the precision of a professional draftsman. In the lower right corner, a title block. Whitfield read it once, set the drawing down for 3 seconds, and then picked it up again and read it again because the first reading had not fully arrived. The drawing was stamped with the seal of the Massachusetts Commercial Bank, Boston. It was a complete set of structural and security plans for the bank's basement vault level, showing the location of every safe installation, every guard post, every access corridor, and every lock mechanism in the building. These were the blueprints used to plan the 1861 robbery. Penhaligon had kept them. 27 years later, they were still here. The original plans for the original crime, sealed in the dark beneath a dead man's house. Whitfield rolled the drawings carefully and tucked them under his arm alongside the ledgers. They came up from the cellar in the last light of the afternoon, loaded what they were carrying into the heavy canvas bags they used for survey equipment, and packed them under the wagon seat beneath a layer of tools and folded canvas. Orinthia stood at the cabin door for a moment before they left, looking back at the main room. The trap door to the cellar was still open. The lamp was still burning below. She pulled the cabin door shut. They had been in Grayfield long enough to know that the road south out of town passed directly in front of the post office and general store, which meant it passed directly in front of the window where Leander Hollowell spent most of his day, and which was 30 yards from the office where Sheriff Obadiah Aldridge kept his desk. Whitfield drove the wagon at an ordinary pace, not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to suggest he was trying not to draw attention. Orinthia sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and neither of them spoke until Grayfield was behind them and the road south entered the first long corridor of spruce and fir. Then Orinthia said, "He was watching us from the post office window. Aldridge. He was at the window when we passed." "I know," Whitfield said. "I saw him." The horse moved steadily on the road south. The forest closed in. The late afternoon light came down through the canopy and long slanted columns that crossed and recrossed the road ahead of them. Somewhere behind them, in a small office in a small town, a man who had known about the vault for years was watching the road they had just traveled, and he was deciding what to do. Whitfield kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins, and thought about Harlan Fairweather's office on Tremont Row, the tobacco smell, the frosted glass, the quality of Fairweather's attention when he was given information that changed the dimensions of a problem. He thought about what Fairweather's face would look like when Whitfield set 14 leather ledgers and a set of stolen bank blueprints on his desk. And he thought about something else, something that had been assembling itself in the back of his mind since he had first read the tracking entry in the last ledger, since he had understood what Pinnacle Land Trust was and what Remington Whitmore was, and what the last 4 months of their lives had actually been. The Colton ring had built its fortune over 2 decades on a foundation of documented crime. Every transaction, every shell company, every property acquisition had been recorded by a meticulous man who had lived with that record for 20 years, and who had, in his final months, continued to track what became of it all. The record was now in a canvas bag under Whitfield Gravenor's wagon seat. And the man who had enforced the eviction that sent them here, the man who had driven the iron nail into their door, the man who had stood in his paneled office and offered $50 for the disruption of 7 years of life, was operating on the assumption that the paper trail connecting his business to its origins had burned or rotted or simply been forgotten. Remington Whitmore did not know that Prescott Penhaligon had never forgotten anything. He did not know that Whitfield and Orinthia Gravenor were 4 hours south and moving steadily toward the one man in Boston whose hatred of men like Whitmore was both professional and personal. And he did not know that the case he had built against them in a Suffolk County courtroom, The manufactured evidence, the paid inspector, the Caldwell and Morse attorneys, the iron nail in the door, all of it was now the least of his problems. Part 3. The weight of paper. They drove through the night, not because they had planned to, but because stopping felt like a concession to something neither of them was willing to concede. The horse was steady, and the road south was clear, and the moon was high enough to give the packed dirt a pale luminescence that made navigation possible, if not comfortable. Orinthia slept in short intervals against Whitfield's shoulder, waking each time the wagon lurched over a root or a frozen rut. Whitfield did not sleep at all. He held the reins and watched the road ahead and listened to the forest on either side, which offered nothing but the creak of branches in the wind and the occasional crack of ice releasing from a high limb. The canvas bags under the seat pressed against his boots with every movement of the wagon. He was aware of them the entire way south, the way a man is aware of a loaded firearm in the room. Not afraid of it exactly, but never able to fully forget it is there. They reached Boston on the second evening, road-worn and hollow-eyed, and went directly to a boarding house on Neelan Street, where a widow named Mrs. Thorne rented rooms by the week, without asking questions, which was a quality Whitfield had thought to verify before they left the city 4 months earlier. He had not known then why that quality might matter. He knew now. He hid the canvas bags under the floorboards of the room. The next morning, he sent a note by messenger to Harlan Fairweather's office on Tremont Row. The note said only, "We have returned from the north and require your immediate attention on a matter of considerable urgency, Gravener." Fairweather's reply came back within the hour. "Come at 2 o'clock, use the back stairs." The instruction to use the back stairs was new. They arrived at Fairweather's office at 2 in the afternoon, carrying the canvas bags, which Whitfield had redistributed into 2 leather survey cases that looked like ordinary professional equipment. The back stairs were a narrow service passage that accessed the second floor through a door that faced the alley rather than the street. Fairweather was waiting for them at the top. He looked at their faces, then at the survey cases, and said nothing until they were inside with the door closed and the inner latch set. "Sit," he said. They sat. Whitfield opened the first survey case and began removing ledgers, setting them on Fairweather's desk one by one. Fairweather watched each one appear with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something fundamental about his understanding of the afternoon. When Whitfield set the rolled architectural drawings down, last Fairweather put on his reading spectacles and unrolled the top one carefully. He read the title block. He read it again. He set the drawing flat on his desk with both palms holding it open and stood there looking at it for a full 30 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Tell me everything. From the beginning, leave nothing out." Whitfield talked for 90 minutes. Fairweather did not interrupt once. He sat in his chair with his hands folded on the desk, and he listened the way he always listened, with the totality of his attention, as though everything else in the world had agreed to pause until he was finished receiving this particular information. When Whitfield stopped talking, the office was very quiet. The afternoon light through the frosted glass had gone orange and thin with the onset of evening. Fairweather picked up the last ledger, the thin one with the tracking entries, and opened it to the page Orinthia had found in the vault. He read the entry for Asset 14. He read the margin notation. He set the ledger back down. "You understand what the currency represents in legal terms," he said. "It cannot be spent," Whitfield said. "It is federal evidence. It is the foundational evidence of a crime committed against a federally chartered institution in 1861, Fairweather said. "The statute of limitations on federal bank fraud does not run. The case is not closed, merely inactive. These ledgers and these drawings constitute the complete evidentiary record of that crime and of every subsequent crime committed using the proceeds. Under the Treasury Department's provisions for asset recovery, the individual or individuals providing foundational evidence leading to the seizure of criminally derived assets are entitled to a reward calculated as a percentage of the recovered value." He paused. "The real property currently held or managed by Pinnacle Land Trust represents at current Boston market valuations approximately $2,300,000. 15% of that figure is $345,000. He looked at Whitfield over his spectacles. "Paid in legitimate currency by the United States government to you and your wife." The number sat in the room between them. Orinthia spoke for the first time since they had arrived. "We do not want to simply hand this to the government and wait," she said. "We want Remington Whitmore to understand what happened. We want him to know who brought it down on him." Fairweather looked at her for a moment, and his expression held something that in another man might have been called admiration. "I believe," he said slowly, "that can be arranged." He spent the next 2 days making arrangements that he did not fully describe to Whitfield and Orinthia, and which they did not press him to describe. On the third morning, he appeared at the Neelan Street boarding house and told them that a meeting had been organized. "I have been in contact with a federal officer," Fairweather said. "His name is Silas Trevithick. He works for the Treasury Department's investigative division out of Washington. He has been assigned to Boston for the past 2 years, quietly examining the financial records of several large property holding companies. He has been building a case that has lacked one essential element. The original ledgers," Whitfield said. "The original ledgers," Fairweather confirmed. "Without provable connection between the current entities and the criminal proceeds they were built on, Trevithick could demonstrate irregular financial practices, but not their source. What you found in that vault provides the source. It closes a chain of evidence that goes back 27 years. He paused. "He wants to meet you tonight, privately." Silas Trevithick was not what Whitfield had expected a Treasury investigator to look like. He was 40 years old, slight, with close-cropped brown hair, going gray at the temples, and the kind of unremarkable face that would be difficult to describe to someone who had not seen it. He wore a dark wool suit with no insignia and carried nothing that identified him as anything other than a businessman stopping in at a hotel for an early evening drink. He met them in a private dining room at the Tremont House with the door closed and a table lamp turned low. Fairweather sat to Whitfield's left. Orinthia sat across from Trevithick and watched him with the same evaluative stillness she had brought to every significant moment since the notice appeared on their door. Trevithick looked at the ledgers for 40 minutes without speaking. He made notes in a small memorandum book with a pencil he sharpened once during the examination. When he reached the last ledger and the tracking entries, he read the page for Asset 14 and then looked up at Orinthia. "This is your former address," he said. "Yes?" He looked back at the page, then reached into his coat and produced a small magnifying glass. He turned to the currency bundle Whitfield had carried as a sample, unwrapped one corner of the wax canvas, and examined the serial numbers printed on the paper band beneath his lens. For a long moment he said nothing, moving the glass slowly along the sequence of numbers stamped in the government ink. Then he set the glass down on the table and looked at Whitfield with an expression that had shifted entirely from the careful neutrality he had maintained for the previous 40 minutes. "I know these numbers," Trevithick said quietly. "The Treasury Department maintains a permanent record of all lost and unrecovered federal currency issues. The 1861 Massachusetts Commercial Bank Series has been on that list for 27 years. He set the magnifying glass in his coat pocket with slow deliberateness. "You understand what you are sitting across from. This is not a local matter. This is the single largest unresolved federal currency theft in the history of New England." The room was very still. "Penn Halligan was monitoring the asset succession in real time," Orinthia said. "He tracked every shell transfer through the newspapers. He knew what Pinnacle Land Trust was and who was operating it." Trevithick nodded. He picked up the rolled architectural drawings. "I need to ask you something directly," he said. "Do you know who else knows about the vault outside of this room?" Whitfield told him about Aldridge, about the warning in the hardware store, the watching from the post office window, the unsigned note in the cabin window. Trevithick's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Obadiah Aldridge has appeared twice in our peripheral investigation," Trevithick said. "We had no grounds to pursue the connection. Now we do." He set the drawings down. "If Aldridge is communicating with anyone connected to Pinnacle, they may already know the vault has been accessed, which means we do not have weeks. We may have days." "Then we move quickly," Fairweather said. "We move tonight," Trevithick said. What happened next unfolded with the organized momentum of something that had been waiting for a long time to begin. Trevithick left the Tremont House and sent 2 telegrams, one to his superior in Washington, one to a federal magistrate in Boston, whose name Whitfield never learned. Fairweather drafted a formal evidentiary submission incorporating the ledgers, the drawings, and a signed affidavit from Whitfield and Orinthia detailing the circumstances of discovery. By midnight, a federal warrant had been signed and sealed. But it was Fairweather who proposed the specific mechanism of Remington Whitmore's undoing, and Trevithick who agreed to it after a pause that suggested he found it professionally irregular and personally satisfying in equal measure. Fairweather sent a letter to Whitmore the following morning on his firm's letterhead. The letter was brief. It informed Whitmore that Fairweather represented the Gravenors in an ongoing matter related to their eviction from the Tremont Street property and that recent developments had raised questions about the legal history of that property's ownership that Whitmore might wish to address before they became a matter of public record. He proposed a mediation meeting at Whitmore's offices at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. He noted that the Gravenors would be present. Whitmore's reply came the same afternoon. He agreed to the meeting in a tone that managed to convey contempt and irritation simultaneously, and which suggested he expected to spend an hour dismissing the grievances of people he had already defeated once and then return to his actual business. Thursday was cold and clear, the kind of late March morning in Boston when the sky is a hard, bright blue and the shadows on the sidewalk have sharp edges. Whitfield and Orinthia walked to Devonshire Street with fair weather between them, and none of them spoke on the way. There was nothing left to prepare. Everything that needed to be said was in the leather cases Fairweather carried. The offices of Pinnacle Land Trust occupied the second floor of a brick building 4 stories tall with brass fixtures on the door and a receptionist who looked at Whitfield and Orinthia the way people look at furniture that has been placed in the wrong room. They were shown to a conference room with a long mahogany table and windows looking out over the street below. Remington Whitmore arrived 7 minutes late, which Whitfield understood was intentional. He came in with a lawyer from Caldwell and Morse, a different one from Price Younger and less certain of himself, and 2 men who were introduced as company directors and who sat against the wall without speaking for the duration of what followed. Whitmore looked at Whitfield and Orinthia and recognized them after a half-second delay. His expression adjusted smoothly, filing them in the correct category, former tenants nuisance manageable. "Mr. Fairweather," he said, taking the chair at the head of the table, "I confess I am uncertain what new ground there is to cover. The eviction proceeding was adjudicated and resolved." "It was," Fairweather said agreeably. He set his leather case on the table and opened it without hurry. "We are not here about the eviction proceeding." He removed a single sheet of paper, a high-quality copy of 1 page from the tracking ledger. The page with the entry for Asset 14 and its corporate succession from Massachusetts Harbor Associates through to Pinnacle Land Trust. He slid it across the mahogany table to Whitmore. Whitmore looked at it. The room was entirely still. The name at the top of the succession chain was Cornelius Colton, written in Penhaligon's precise hand beside the year 1861. Below it, the chain of company names each linked to the next ending with Pinnacle Land Trust and the notation Agent R. Whitmore. Whitfield watched Whitmore's face. He had wondered what this moment would look like, and the answer was nothing like what he had imagined. He had imagined anger, perhaps, or denial. What he saw instead was something much more complete than either. The color left Whitmore's face in a way that was almost physical, as though a structural support had been removed. The careful arrangement of his expression did not exactly collapse. It simply became irrelevant, a facade over a void. "Where did you get this?" Whitmore said. His voice had lost its cadence. The words came out flat and equidistant. "Prescott Penhaligon," Fairweather said, "kept very thorough records." Whitmore looked at Whitfield for the first time since sitting down. Not the dismissive glance of a man processing furniture. A look of genuine reckoning, the look of a man understanding for the first time the full dimensions of what has happened to him. "You have the ledgers," Whitmore said. "All 14, Whitfield said. A silence opened in the room. One of the company directors against the wall shifted in his chair. The Caldwell and Morse attorney had stopped writing. Then something changed in Whitmore's face. The emptiness filled with something else, a specific kind of fear that was not personal but organizational. The fear of a man who answers to someone above him and is calculating what that person will do when they find out. "You do not understand the nature of the people involved in this," Whitmore said. His voice had dropped. The corporate formality was entirely gone. "This is not a commercial dispute. If you have those documents and they reach the wrong hands, you are placing yourselves in a position of very serious personal danger." "We are aware of the people involved," Orinthia said. "We have read their complete financial history for 23 years. "I am offering you protection," Whitmore said, and the desperation in it was naked and unadorned. "I can make this disappear for both of us. Whatever figure Fairweather has suggested, I will double it. Tremont Street, the building itself, I will sign the deed over to a trust in your names. Cash payment today. Whatever you want." Orinthia looked at him across the mahogany table. She had sat in this man's city in one of this man's buildings teaching other people's children arithmetic for 6 years, and she had come home one October evening to find an iron nail driven into her door. She had spent 3 months in a courtroom watching his lawyers manufacture a picture of her husband as financially unreliable. She had slept on a cabin floor in the deep cold of a New Hampshire winter and worked until her hands bled, and she had sat in a vault in the earth and read the complete documented record of what kind of thing this man was the current version of. She said, "We already have what we want." The door of the conference room opened. Silas Trevithick came in first, followed by two other men in dark coats whose bearing required no badge to identify. Behind them, two uniformed officers of the Boston Police present as a matter of federal protocol. Trevithick crossed to Whitmore's side of the table, produced a folded document from his interior coat pocket, and set it on the table in front of Whitmore without ceremony. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I am Silas Trevithick of the United States Treasury Department's Investigative Division. This is a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to conceal criminally derived assets, fraudulent transfer of real property, and obstruction of a federal investigation. You are advised that you have the right to retain legal counsel." He glanced at the Caldwell and Morse attorney, "which appears to be arranged." Remington Whitmore looked down at the warrant on the table. He did not pick it up. He sat in the chair at the head of his own conference table and looked at the document for a long moment, and then he looked across the table at Whitfield Gravenor, and Whitfield held that look without looking away. He had driven a nail into a door and called it business. He had paid inspectors and filed false claims and outmaneuvered tenants in courtrooms and called all of it progress. He had operated for years on the assumption that the paper trail connecting his business to its origins had dissolved with time, that the dead stayed buried and the past stayed past. He had been wrong about one thing. Prescott Penhaligon, living alone in the northern forest with his newspapers and his ledgers and his guilt and his meticulous handwriting, had never stopped watching, had never let go of any of it. Trevithick nodded to the officers, and Remington Whitmore was escorted out of his own conference room. The Caldwell and Morse attorney gathered his papers and left without speaking to anyone. The two company directors against the wall sat for another moment, uncertain what they were supposed to do now, and then they left as well. Whitfield and Orinthia and Fairweather remained at the table in the empty room. The sound of the street below came through the windows, horse traffic, a wagon, someone calling to someone else. The ordinary movement of a city going about its business. Fairweather began returning papers to his case with the methodical calm of a man concluding an ordinary afternoon. "There is one more thing you should know," he said. "Trevithick told me this morning." Whitfield looked at him. "Sheriff Aldridge was taken into custody in Grayfield yesterday evening," Fairweather said. "Two of Trevithick's men had been up there since Tuesday watching the property. The night before last, a man arrived at the cabin. He had come from Portsmouth by the railroad and then by horse. He attempted to access the cellar through the exterior foundation wall with a commercial iron bar." Fairweather closed his case. "He was apprehended at the property. In his possession were a letter of instruction and the name of the party who had sent him. The letter implicated Aldridge directly as the communication link between that party and the Pinnacle organization." "Who sent him?" Orinthia asked. "A man who had been associated with the Colton organization in the 1870s and who had remained connected to the financial infrastructure when the original organization dissolved. His name is not important. What is important is that in his statement to Trevithick's officers, he provided a piece of information that none of us had." Fairweather paused, and for once his composure held something underneath it that was not quite professional. "Prescott Penhaligon did not die entirely alone," Fairweather said. "The night before he died, he walked into Grayfield and knocked on Obadiah Aldridge's door. Aldridge was not yet sheriff then. He was a younger man, a deputy, and Penhaligon had done business with him at the general store for years. Penhaligon told Aldridge what was in the vault. He described the ledgers, the currency, the drawings. He said he wanted someone to know that he had been carrying it too long, and he needed someone to know before he was gone." Whitfield set down the survey case he had picked up. "Aldridge did not report it," Orinthia said. "It was not a question. Aldridge listened to everything Penhaligon told him, and then he made his calculation, and his calculation was that the information was worth more to him as a private asset than as a public duty. He waited. He became sheriff. He watched for the property to eventually surface through the tax auction system, and he arranged to be present at county proceedings in order to manage who acquired it. He was the man in the canvas coat at the auction. The room was very still. "He let someone push the bid up to find our ceiling," Whitfield said slowly. "And then he stopped because he did not want us to get suspicious and withdraw. He wanted us to buy it. He wanted someone who was not connected to Pinnacle to take legal ownership," Fairweather said. "Someone he could approach afterward and make an arrangement with. The note in your window was his first approach. When you left for Boston without responding, he panicked and contacted his associates. Whitfield thought about Penhaligon in the dark on a winter night, old and alone, walking into town to knock on a younger man's door because the weight of what he knew had finally become more than he could carry by himself. Wanting at the end to give it to someone who would do something with it. Aldridge had taken it and held it for profit, and Penhaligon had died without knowing that the one person he had trusted with his secret had chosen silence over conscience. He thought about the tracking entries in the last ledger written in a slightly shakier hand, following the corporate succession of his life's criminal work across the decades. Penhaligon had known what Pinnacle was. He had known what was being done with the money he had laundered, what buildings it lived in now, what names it operated under. And he had written it down, every bit of it, right up until his hand could no longer hold the pen steadily. Not just to preserve the record, to leave it for whoever came next. Orinthia had been watching Whitfield's face, and she spoke now in the quiet of the conference room. He chose the wrong person the first time, she said. But the ledgers were always going to find the right ones eventually. He made sure of that. 10 months later, in the second week of January 1889, a letter arrived at the Neelan Street address Whitfield had provided to Fairweather as a contact point. It bore the seal of the United States Treasury Department. The federal proceedings against Pinnacle Land Trust and its associated entities had concluded. 17 properties across Boston, Providence, and Portland, all traceable through the ledger records to the original Colton Ring transactions, had been seized and their titles transferred to federal receivership. The total appraised value was $2,340,000. In accordance with the Treasury Department's provisions for informant compensation in asset recovery proceedings and reflecting the foundational nature of the evidence provided by Whitfield and Orinthia Gravenor, the department had calculated their reward at 15% of the liquid asset value recovered. The figure in the letter was $345,000. Remington Whitmore had been convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. The man from Portsmouth who had come to the cabin was sentenced to 4 years. Obadiah Aldridge, on a guilty plea to charges of obstruction and conspiracy, received 2 years in the permanent revocation of his office. The Tremont Street block, under a federal court order, was designated as residential rental property at controlled rates for a period of 20 years. The families who had been evicted in 1887 and 1888 were offered first priority on the available units. 3 of them returned. On a morning in late April of 1889, Whitfield and Orinthia Gravenor stood on the porch of a house that had not existed 4 months earlier. It stood on the same 4.5 acres in Coos County, on the same ground above the same vault that now held only air, its contents removed by federal agents who had come with a court order and a team of 6 men, and who had treated the ledgers and the currency with the careful handling of people who understood they were touching the end of something very long. The new house was timber frame built by a crew from Lancaster over the winter months, with a full foundation poured in November before the ground froze. It had 3 rooms on the main floor and a sleeping loft, large windows on the south face that caught the afternoon light, and a porch that ran the full front length and looked out through the spruce trees to where the White Mountains were just becoming visible as the last of the snow retreated up their flanks. Millicent Gravenor sat in one of the 2 chairs Whitfield had built and placed on the porch. She had driven up from Grayfield that morning with a pot of coffee and a quantity of fresh bread, which was her way of marking significant occasions. She looked out at the mountains and drank her coffee and did not say much because she was a woman who understood that some moments did not require commentary. Orinthia was inside arranging the last of the books on the shelving Whitfield had built along the east wall. He could hear her through the open window, the quiet sounds of someone making order in a space that was theirs, and only theirs, that no notice could be nailed to, and no company with a manufactured name could reach. Whitfield leaned on the porch rail and looked south down through the trees toward where the road curved away and disappeared. He thought about Penhaligon living in the previous house on this ground for 20 years, watching the forest with the particular alertness of a man who has done something he cannot undo. Keeping his records, tracking the succession of his crimes through the newspaper notices, following each company name change, each property transfer, writing it all down in his precise hand until the hand could no longer manage precision. He thought about what it must have cost, all of it. Not the money, the other thing, the specific weight of a secret that is also a confession, carried for 2 decades in the silence of the northern woods, with no one to give it to and no way to put it down. Penhaligon had found the wrong person to trust with it in the end. But he had kept the records anyway, and the records had found their way to the right hands through a sequence of events that no one had designed or intended an iron nail in a door on Tremont Street. A classified notice in a county paper, a tax auction on a February morning, a measurement in a notebook that did not add up. 7 feet of missing space and everything that followed from it. Millicent set down her coffee cup and said without preamble, "Did you ever figure out what he was like, Penhaligon? As a man?" Whitfield thought about it. "He was a man who made a choice early," Whitfield said, "and spent the rest of his life keeping the records of what that choice cost everyone else. I think he wanted someone to find them. I think the ledgers were always meant to be found." Millicent looked at him. "By you. By someone," Whitfield said. "We were just the ones who arrived." Orinthia came out through the door and stood beside Whitfield, and she looked out at the same mountains he was looking at, and for a moment, none of them said anything. The forest was full of the sounds of April meltwater running somewhere below them, the first birds returning from the south, the long creak of timber settling into warmth after a hard winter. In his coat pocket, Whitfield had a folded piece of drafting paper. He had drawn it himself 2 weeks earlier, working at the kitchen table with the instruments he had used for 6 years to measure and record other people's buildings. It was a floor plan of the house behind him, drawn to scale with every room noted and every window placed exactly where he had placed it in reality. He had signed it in the lower right corner the way architectural draftsmen always did, the builder's name, the date, and the name of the structure. He had written the Gravener House, W. Gravener, 1889. The first building he had ever measured that belonged entirely to him. Orinthia put her hand through his arm, and the mountains were bright in the April light. And whatever Remington Whitmore was looking at in his federal cell that morning, it was not this.